Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Across the country, an estimated 1 million pensioners are losing out on pension increases they ought to be entitled to, simply because the hard shift they put in to pay into their pension happened to occur before an arbitrary date in a calendar. This isn't good enough. Today, I've called this debate to shed light on the injustice of the lack of statutory increases for pre-1997 defined benefit pension schemes, and to ask the Minister what the Government is going to do about it. Prior to the 6th of April 1997, defined benefit pension schemes in the UK were not legally required to increase in line with inflation. This oversight left pensioners who had worked hard for their whole life to pay into a pension guaranteeing security in retirement at risk of seeing their hard work outstripped by a rising cost of living, reducing their financial position in retirement. The 1995 Pensions Act sought to address this problem, introducing statutory limited price indexation, meaning these pensions were mandated in law to rise as if inflation eroded their real value. However, the change only applied to pension contributions made after April 1997. Almost 30 years on, pre-1997 defined benefit pensions are subject to the same injustice identified and partially resolved by the Government all that time ago. It is up to the trustees of these pre-1997 funds to decide the level of pension increases granted. I've secured this debate, and I'm aware there are a number of honourable members who will be seeking to intervene, to challenge the Government to finish the job, started almost 3 decades ago, of ensuring that every recipient of a defined benefit pension scheme has the dignity and security in retirement they've worked so hard for. The pre-1997 Pension Justice campaign of over 400 pensioners, who I pay tribute to for their persistent campaigning on this issue, have informed me of at least 13 companies where this spell of zero increases, effectively real terms cuts to pensions every year, stretches to a decade or more. Top of the list, sadly, is Nissan, which has not increased these kinds of pensions for a quarter of a century. In those 25 years, the price of goods has almost doubled. A shopping basket from 2001 worth £100 would now cost £194. Prior to this 25-year period, the trustees of the Nissan pension had set a precedent that, when the pension scheme delivered a surplus, a discretionary increase would be passed on to members. Between 1992 and 2001, when the scheme was in surplus, increases of between 2 and 3% were granted. This pattern was disturbed after 2001 when the scheme went into deficit. But when in 2022 the scheme returned to a surplus, the trustees broke with precedent and refused to grant an increase. The same has happened again every year since, which leads the pensioners to fear that there is a new policy from their trustees that no discretionary increases will ever again be handed to the retired Nissan workers holding these pensions. Yes, I will give way.
Gentleman who's making an excellent presentation. Rather curiously, in the case of the ExxonMobil pensioners, up until 2023, they got automatically indexed uplifts in their pensions, but for some reason from that date onwards the company changed its policy and now they are not getting the discretionary uplift. But the trustees there say that they have no power. It's up to the company to decide whether this discretionary uplift occurs. So isn't one way forward to ask the Minister perhaps to give an undertaking that the trustees should have the power to award such discretionary uplifts linked to indexation?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his right honourable gentleman for his very useful intervention and drawing attention to that particular anomaly. And I can see that my honourable friend and neighbour wished to intervene.
I thank my honourable friend and neighbour for giving way on this, and can I congratulate him on securing this debate and for raising this issue. He will have constituents, as I have, who have been writing to us on this issue and feel very strongly that an injustice has been done.
I thank my honourable friend for her intervention. Indeed, I've had both written communications and met with constituents who work alongside her constituents or who used to work alongside her constituents at Nissan. Sadly, in the case of Nissan and countless others, trustees have proven themselves to not be accountable enough for the decisions that affect those holding pensions. Evidence submitted to the Pensions Ombudsman shows multiple cases where trustees have not even considered key factors when deciding discretionary increases. I'm happy to give way.
I congratulate my honourable friend on securing this debate and laying out very clearly the injustice that has been done. But does he have concerns, as I have, that the make-up of the trustee boards really means that it is the company that is in control, either because they're current employees and therefore their promotion will depend on the company, or they've been appointed specifically by the company, and therefore even where, as in the case of 3Ms, the trustees vote unanimously to have a rise, it can be blocked by the company and has been for successive years with these companies.
I thank my honourable friend for that contribution. I absolutely share that concern. My understanding from the constituent that I met about this issue was that on Nissan's trustees, there's a majority of company appointees who outvote the trustees representing the members of the scheme. So key factors have been ignored, from ignoring inflation to overlooking member contributions. For this reason, I believe statutory intervention is urgently required. I'm happy to give way.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My honourable friend is making an excellent speech, and may I congratulate him for securing today's debate. Has he also noticed in his work on this issue that in some cases some international companies are paying inflationary increases in other jurisdictions where they operate, but not in the UK? There have been a number of instances of this in my own area where pensioners from Berkshire in schemes which are run by international companies have done exactly that. So the Irish pensioners, for example, or the US pensioners get an increase, but not the British pensioners.
I thank my honourable friend for that very useful contribution. I was not aware of that, and I'm shocked, actually. I think that that's a further injustice if pensioners in the UK are treated differently to the pensioners of the same company in other territories. While the Ombudsman can establish whether procedure has been followed, only politicians can decide whether outcomes are fair. So my first question to the Minister is, could the Minister please set out what scope he sees for his role in ensuring fairness over defined benefit pension schemes? There's another injustice in the way the Nissan scheme is treating its pension holders. Members across the House will be aware that most people take up the option to take a quarter of their pension as a tax-free lump sum. This money is vital to kick-starting retirement, allowing people to pay off their mortgages and other major debts or make major purchases when they first become pensioners. However, the split between pre- and post-1997 pensions means this scheme, which should be hugely beneficial for those retiring, can and is currently being used against them. The Nissan pension scheme has been paying out its lump sums from those parts of people's pension funds where the payments would have increased with inflation, and leaving in their pension pot the pre-1997 part where the benefits won't be tracking inflation. The impact of this means that once a lump sum has been taken, the parts of the pension that are left receive lower or no annual increases. This is clearly unjust. Worst of all, this change wasn't even directly communicated with pension holders. Instead, my constituents only knew about this, frankly, accounting trick as they noticed their pension increasing by less than anticipated over the years. Because of this, I was hoping the Minister would be able to set out what the government's position is on which part of these kinds of pensions should be paid out as a lump sum, and whether he will work to protect pensioners from quirks of sum calculation being used to deny them of the increases they need to keep up with the change in the cost of living. I want to recognise, and I'm sure that my honourable friend and neighbour who also has many constituents working there would agree with this, that Nissan is otherwise an excellent employer and a hugely important contributor to our regional economy in the North East and indeed to British manufacturing industry as a whole. Nissan has not only employed people, it's provided jobs deep into the supply chain as well. It's a real shame, given their status in the region as a very much admired employer, that they seem to be forgetting that their success, bringing employment and regeneration to the North East over the last 40 years, comes from their loyal workforce. These cost-saving exercises on the pension scheme are no way to treat employees who work so hard and deserve a decent retirement. Crucially, the discretion in what increases pension holders receive currently lies with the trustees. However, the most common long-term target for a pension scheme is buying out with an insurer, an outcome which takes decisions of this nature out of the hands of trustees. When a scheme is bought out, trustee discretion disappears entirely, meaning that without legislative reform, thousands of pensioners will lose even the faint hope that the trustees might give them an increase. Given that the government has made clear its desire to put more power into the hands of trustees of pension schemes, I would appreciate if the Minister could set out whether the government has made any assessment of this risk and whether it intends to take any action for those pension holders affected by insurer buyout. To illustrate the financial impact of this injustice, I will tell you about a constituent of mine who I've met, Steve. Steve started working for Nissan in 1985, meaning a considerable amount of his pension contributions came before the 1997 cut-off. He retired in January 2016. Since his retirement, CPI inflation has totalled to 40.3%, while Steve's pension has increased by only 8.3%, the minimum legally required for his post-1997 contributions. In real terms, Steve's pension has decreased by a staggering 32.5% in just 9 years. In that time since 2016, when Steve retired, the state pension has increased by 48%. We are right to be proud of the increases to the state pension that we have delivered, including £575 this year for the new state pension. If we believe in the importance of protecting state pensioners, a belief we're backed up with real money out of the door, then why shouldn't we apply the same standard to defined benefit pension schemes? Steve is just one example of someone being shortchanged by the anomaly. I know that the honourable members for Hartlepool, Blythe and Ashington, Blaydon and Consett, City of Durham, Newcastle East and Wallsend, South Shields, Easington, Jarrow and Gateshead East and others have all been advocating for constituents involved in the dispute with the Nissan pension scheme. I also want to pay tribute to my honourable friend, the member for Washington and Gateshead South, who has been fighting for the hard-working people at Nissan as the constituency MP for the site, and I congratulate her on her very recent well-deserved promotion to ministerial office, which unfortunately precludes her from participating in this debate. Nissan is not an isolated case. It's indicative of a much wider problem here, where the state is failing to stand up for fairness and the value of a pension is drastically determined by which side of an arbitrary date cut-off contributions were made. Parliament has already been presented with a clear solution to this matter. I want to commend my honourable friend, the member for Llanelli, on bringing forward Amendment NC 22 to the Pension Schemes Bill, which would have legislated to address this issue. Disappointingly, the government indicated opposition to the amendment and it was not put forward for a vote. I wanted to ask the Minister whether he would elaborate on why the government was unwilling to support my honourable friend's amendment. I am aware that ministers have previously cautioned against retrospective changes to pensions that would go the full way of correcting the injustice. While I do not agree that we should accept an injustice just because it has already happened, I was hoping the Minister could also consider whether a statutory increase to pre-1997 defined benefit pensions could be enacted purely from this point forward, even if it could not be retrospectively applied. Earlier this month, I coordinated a joint letter with colleagues whose constituents are missing out on money that we feel they are entitled to call on ministers to address the problem I am raising today by supporting NC 22 or committing to bring forward similar measures before the Pension Schemes Bill achieves royal assent. The Pension Schemes Bill now sits with the other place, and I'm coming to my conclusion, where I know my predecessor, now Lord Beamish, will be making the case for those adversely affected by this oversight in the law. I'd urge the government to accept any forthcoming amendments on this matter and commit to working with those of us advocating for constituents on a fair resolution. I understand the bill is completing its final stages, meaning time is running out for this action. Not only would increases to these pensions benefit more than 1 million pensioners in question, they would also mean greater tax receipts to the state, boosting public services, allowing more investment in communities like the one I represent. I know that already the government has taken limited but welcome steps to address injustice for holders of pre-1997 pensions. It has announced legislative changes to allow the Pension Protection Fund and the Financial Assistance Scheme to start paying inflation-linked increases capped at 2.5% on pre-1997 pensions, something that had been prohibited under previous law. Ministers have confirmed that this change will benefit around 250,000 PPF members, improving their payments by an average of £400 a year, with the earliest increases expected from January 2027, once legislation is in place. I know the government has also stated that reforms to the pension schemes bill, particularly those related to surplus release, are intended to give trustees more flexibility to address this issue in future. I therefore wanted to ask whether the principles that have guided the government in making these welcome adjustments have been applied to the remaining pre-1997 pension holders who have still been left behind. I hope members, and I really am coming to my conclusion here, will agree that there is no justification for why the constituents I have raised today shouldn't receive a pension that keeps up with the rising cost of living. I know the House is committed to dignity and security in retirement as a key part of the social contract that we exist to uphold. I have even heard anecdotal evidence of pensioners affected by this change having to return to work after they retired or downsizing from their family home to make ends meet. No pensioner should see their dignity and security eroded by an accident of timing. I therefore urge the government to do more to apply these values to the case of pre-1997 pensions. I look forward to hearing from my honourable friend, the Minister, on this matter.
Very briefly, Jesse Norman.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker, and let me congratulate the member from North Durham on his absolutely excellent speech and on procuring this debate and all those who have participated in it. And let me also thank the Minister for allowing me a few words. I will also, if I may, on your behalf, Madam Deputy Speaker, mention your constituent Steve Morby, because I know he has been a key campaigner in this important and very difficult area. It's one in which I first got involved before I became a Member of Parliament in 2007. And I'd like to pay particular tribute to the late Roy Harries and Les Collard because they brought to my attention the injustice that had been perpetrated on the older pensioners at the Special Metals Wigan Pension Fund. And hundreds of people were affected by it, many of them, alas, now dead. And those widows, as they almost invariably were, who were left, receiving half of a much diminished pension. They have not received one single penny in top-up payments since that legislation kicked in, and only because the company's trustees have decided not to pay any discretionary bonuses at any point. The result is their incomes are 55% lower than they would have been at that time, and half of that if they were a widow. It is an absolute outrage and a great historic injustice, and as the member says, the fact that historic injustice occurred in the past does not mean it is not important to address it now. And of course, it was a clear blunder in the legislation. I've raised this over the years in this House. It's a matter of great embarrassment that previous Conservative administrations and coalition government did not address it. But the opportunity exists now to do that. The company, and here I'm afraid I recognise the point that often the trustees are controlled by the company directly or indirectly, whether or not they are formally independent. The company has not paid any bonuses or top-ups. And, of course, they are now owned by a large American company, PCC, which is itself owned by Warren Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway. And I have written to Buffett and had him say that he was not willing to help either. And it's a source of great sadness to me that even such a great philanthropist and entrepreneur as him should have failed to do that. So my question to the Minister is this. Given that for many of these years that pension fund has been in surplus, could he not now, as well as considering the question of historic injustice, also consider the question of whether or not those funds, those trustees, should be required, out of the surpluses they have, to pay top-ups to the pensioners that we're talking about, if not retrospectively, and I hope they would consider retrospectively, then at least in some generous way that recognises the terrible injustice that has been done and pays proper tribute to Les Collard and to Roy Harries and all of the great men and women of the Wigan pensioners who we justly celebrate and whose injustice we seek to fight. Thank you.
Torsten.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm pleased that the Right Honourable Member for North Durham has secured tonight's debate on this important matter and for the thoughtful way he described the impact it has on his constituents, but speaking on behalf of many other members as well, and particularly those members of the Nissan pension scheme. And can I join him in praising the persistent campaigners on this issue? He mentioned one of the organisations in particular who I've met with and have been campaigning on this for very many years and haven't shown any let-up in their energy in doing so during that time. A period of high inflation and the return of many DB schemes to surplus has rightfully put up in lights the situation of members whose pre-1997 benefits are not protected by statutory indexation. And during the passage of the Pension Schemes Bill, this wider debate has rightly featured heavily. It was also discussed by the Work and Pensions Select Committee prior to the last election, and as my honourable friend said, new clause 22, which was debated here at some length with many powerful speeches, including from my honourable friend from Llanelli, were heard. The Right Honourable Member for Hereford and South Herefordshire has been raising this issue, as he says, for many years, and I've also discussed it with the honourable member for New Forest East. I've met with many scheme members and their representatives, including very recently the member for my honourable friend for Llanelli, and 3 members met in Swansea to discuss exactly this issue in a lot of detail. I was grateful for their time and for her organising that discussion. I've listened and I recognise the difficulties faced by some scheme members who can now see their income, their living standards and the quality of their retirement eroded by inflation, as the honourable member finished with in his statement. It's particularly understandable that members are disappointed when schemes do not award discretionary increases where schemes are in a strong funding position, and that is obviously the change that has happened over the course of the last few years. As my right honourable friend will know, the defined benefit pension schemes have very different approaches to awarding pre-97 indexation. The truth is, and obviously we won't be discussing these schemes at length today, that most do provide for increases under their scheme rules. Others do not allow it or require it at all. And then a significant number only allow discretionary increases where there is the agreement between both trustees and the sponsoring employer, which are the cases we're mainly focusing on in today's debate. The result is that in some cases, when employers are unwilling to support discretionary increases, even when the scheme is in a strong funding position, trustees can effectively be prevented from acting. Of course.
I'm very grateful. I won't detain him, but of course, if a group of trustees never pays a discretionary bonus, even though the scheme is in surplus, it does start to look like it is a policy of theirs to discriminate against a subset of their beneficiaries. And I think that's illegal. And I'd be grateful for his guidance on that.
I actually think there's a slightly harder case, which is examples where schemes had an established practice of paying discretionary increases. The honourable member mentioned cases before the turn of this century in the Nissan case, where there was an established practice of paying those increases. That was seen as the norm. Then for different phases, sometimes when a scheme has slipped into deficit, as many schemes did, they then stopped, and then they did not restart when the surplus arrived. That's the case that's being raised here. In many ways, those are the harder case to understand. And I'll come on to maybe about how we think about those cases as we go forward. But the pensions regulator, absolutely.
I understand why the honourable thinks they're harder. In some respects, they're actually less hard, because in those cases, changes have been made reflecting circumstances. In the cases I'm talking about, it's a policy to discriminate against a settled group of beneficiaries. That's the bit that I think is potentially illegal.
I hear the point he makes. In general, I'm not going to comment on individual legal cases, obviously, but the basis of the distinction at 1997 obviously reflects the decisions taken in 1995 by a previous Conservative administration about wanting to introduce statutory indexation, but not wanting to do that for accruals that had already taken place. That's the 1995 Act that brought in the 1997 onwards statutory indexation. As I was saying, we can recognise the underlying reasons for this situation, not retrospectively changing the basis of scheme rules, while sharing members' absolutely huge frustrations with it. And that is why I continue to encourage trustees and sponsoring employers to think carefully about the effect of inflation on members' benefits when making decisions. The pension regulator, as I said, already sets out that trustees should consider specifically, not just generally, specifically consider the situation of those members and whether the scheme has a history of making such awards, the point I was just making. Pensions legislation sets minimum legal standards that all schemes must meet. And they are designed to strike this balance between fair and workable and stable DB landscape. I completely recognise the case for change that the Right Honourable Member for New Forest East made today and has made in the past. The challenge, obviously, is that it would be unreasonable to retrospectively change long-standing rules in blanket terms in a way that would put some scheme stability at risk. Either some scheme stability at risk today by changing fundamentally their funding position, or in future where we don't know, what the world looks like. I'll of course give way.
But if he would follow the recommendation of at least giving the trustees the full power to make the decision over discretionary awards and taking it away from the company, one can be pretty sure that if the scheme went into deficit, the trustees would act accordingly.
I'll come on to in a second the point he's making, which is about where power lies in this system. My honourable friend.
Thank the Minister for his time in meeting us in Swansea, as well as the time he spent on this topic here in the House. He mentions the disadvantages of making any sort of blanket legislation, but would he not agree that there are ways that you can caveat it, such as when the scheme is in surplus? And does he not recognise that, in fact, most of these schemes were actually paying increases until they then stopped, either because of a financial crisis or because they realised they didn't have to? So there are options that could be explored. Would he be willing to do that?
Well, my honourable friend has, as I said before, been a powerful campaigner on this, and I absolutely recognise the point she makes about where there was a habit of paying discretionary increases in the past. On the question of what we do about it, let me come on to my remarks in terms of what the government's approach is, and then maybe offer two reflections specifically on the points that have been raised that we might want to continue making progress on, even if I can't satisfy all the demands for instantaneous change today. Now, as I was saying, what are we doing? Well, the reforms introduced in the Pension Schemes Bill will give more trustees of such schemes the flexibility to release surplus. This will help shape the balance of power between trustees and employers when it comes to well-funded schemes. So there is not nothing we can do, and I think the Pension Schemes Bill will make a difference, particularly in the kind of schemes that are being raised tonight, which are those with a surplus today. Now, the decision to release surplus will remain entirely with the trustees. This will place them in a better position to negotiate benefit improvements as part of any release. And it is entirely for trustees working with the employer to determine how members may benefit. Let me be really clear. If trustees wish to insist on discretionary pre-1997 indexation as a condition for surplus release, they will be entitled to do so. I expect many will, given the discussions I have had with them. We're obviously in early stages of that bill. It hasn't passed through yet, and also employers and trustees are thinking through a world where they suddenly find themselves with a surplus and are thinking about what that means for the future of their pension scheme in many cases. Now, these reforms recognise both trustees and members' understandable frustration with the status quo, but also the diverse circumstances of DB schemes. Madam Deputy Speaker, let me end with two reflections on the wider contributions that members have made, particularly the honourable member that has brought us here today. Firstly, whatever the scheme rules, there is no excuse for employers not to fully engage with trustees on these decisions and these questions. And I've heard too often from members and from trustees that is not the case. And I will take away to consider what more we can do in this regard to make sure that there is an open consultation and people are clear about what is going on and how decisions are being taken. And secondly, I do recognise, given the importance of this matter, that it would be beneficial to develop a clearer understanding of the circumstances, particularly in issues being raised in which well-funded schemes are choosing actively not to award discretionary increases, particularly where the employer consent is the binding constraint. The pensions regulator has been considering how it might build its evidence base in this area, and I will talk to them in the weeks and months ahead about what more we can do in that regard. And let me finish by just paying tribute to my honourable friend from North Durham and the others that have participated in tonight's debate, but also those members who are not here tonight but have consistently raised this issue with me. I will be meeting other ones of those in the coming weeks as well who have asked to discuss this with themselves and their constituents. It's important that we have the chance to discuss these important matters tonight, and I'm glad that we've had the chance to discuss them. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.